Good evening. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Intelligence Squared debate. We're calling this No Laughing Matter here at the Comedy Cellar. It's our first episode. It's a real departure for us. I'm Clea Connor. I'm the CEO of Intelligence Squared. I got us into this mess. I'm just curious, how many of you have been to a live Intelligence Squared debate before? We have a huge new audience with us, and welcome back for those of you that have been here. A little background. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, debate-driven media company. We produce television, radio, podcasts, and have built a community around the idea of being open-minded, open to ideas and the free expression of ideas. So we're really excited to kind of kick this off at the Comedy Cellar. We haven't done a live debate in New York in some time because of the pandemic, so excited you could join us on such short notice. This show's going to be really interesting. I think we're at an interesting moment in American history where we really have to reflect about what it means to have a debate and what it means to consider, points of view we disagree with. And that's what we're going to do here tonight with civility and respect. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be fun. So first up is going to be a comedian who performs here at Comedy Cellar all the time. He's going to kick us off. He's uniquely qualified to do so. His name's Chris Turner. He's a British import, and so are we. And I think you're going to love him. He's actually just off of a residency in Las Vegas for a Cirque du Soleil show, the first time a stand-up comedian's ever been featured in one of those shows. So very excited to welcome Chris Turner to the stage.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My gosh, intelligence and comedy. That's why you have me. That's why I'm here. A British comedian, famously the most intelligent of the comedy. I'll take it as a compliment. I think it's just the accent. It's the power of the British accent. I can say whatever I want, and audiences are like, that's the smartest thing I've ever heard. He probably went to Oxford. I did as well. I did. But I studied archaeology, which is why I do this now. Great job. So excited to be performing in front of a debating audience. This is, I think, the only show I'll ever be heckled by someone going, I disagree. Expand your workings. It is a powerful accent to have living in America. I just lie to Americans all the time, and they believe anything I say. I was at a motel breakfast in West Virginia. There was a man by the waffle machine. I thought, let me see how far I can take this. Just walked on over, said, did you know maple syrup is just honey that's made by Canadian bees? Good day. Wandered away. It's we should acknowledge it's a very strange time for British people at the moment. We have a king. You seem very unsure about that audience. You're like, is he going to come back over here and tax us again? No, we settled that. We have a king. The main change for us is we had to change our motto. We've had to stop saying, God save the Queen, because it turned out that didn't work. It's not treason as long as we don't air this radio show in the United Kingdom. You don't syndicate it, do you? This only goes out in America. I can't be tried. We have to change it. We have to say, God save the king now. It's a bad motto anyway, compared to Americans. You guys chose God bless America. That covers everyone. We were very selfish. Just, no, please keep one little old lady alive. Just long enough that her son never gets to be in charge. Oh, drat. I do live in your country. I live here. Moved here following my dream. My dream is to become a rapper. That's my goal. And there is one exasperated person in the front row who just went, but that's how you all felt inside. It's true. I'm a rapper. I've been rapping ever since I was 12 years old. I started listening to Eminem. Obviously, I call him by his Roman name, Thousand and Thousand. That's the only comedy show that joke works at. Every other show, they're like, we don't understand. Here, you were like, oh, a Roman numeral joke. Very erudite, Chris. A witticism one can agree with. I like it. I loved Dr. Dre as well, but I was 12 when I started listening, so I thought it was pronounced Dr. E. less sure about that one, aren't we? We're like, who is this Dr. Dre? We don't like him. He's a gangster rapper. He raps about three main things: guns and women and money. Those are the three main. Women and money are the two that I prefer out of those. I like women. I like money. I like my women. Like my money. Legal, tender. Just bringing out all the wordplay for this gig. I asked the organisation, I said, why did you book me? And they said, well, we Googled you, and there was a review of you that said your jokes were sometimes more clever than they are funny. I was like, you realise that's a bad review, right? They go, not for us. This is brilliant. This is what we want, more aha than ha-ha. I feel like I'm really kind of edging you. I do rap. I do freestyle rap. That is rap that's improvised in the moment based on your suggestions on what you lovely people would like to hear a rap about. And so for this very special event, I'm going to ask what you guys would like to hear a rap about, but be creative, be imaginative. Don't be like a drunken comedy lout gang who are just saying strippers and beer. Be creative, be imaginative. And just know that you can be as difficult as a man called Klaus, who at a gig in Hamburg said, "A day in the life of an Aztec high priest." Do a rap about that, English boy. And because we are here to listen and partake in a debate, I will ask for a couple of suggestions to be kind of molded in that way. So we've got some friends and couples in the audience. I would like to get a suggestion first from a couple of a recent debate or argument or disagreement that you had. So if we've got any couples in the front row who are willing to share a recent thing here. People here who, you look both so handsome, but it's also possible you could be siblings. That's how you're both 10 out of 10s. You always got to check. Are you a couple? Sure. So when your lady is that attractive, you need to be more confident. You need to be like, yes, yes, thank you very much. Yes, sir. Gosh, it feels back over 250 years ago when we were in charge. What's a recent disagreement or debate that you had with your partner?
We don't have debates. It's purely harmonious, relationship.
So you're saying that, but the lady's shaking her head. So, a recent, maybe something you dislike about your partner, a bad habit or something. And I'll ask the lady.
No, he has no bad habits.
Oh, I know one. She wakes up at 4:30 in the morning, and then just does that.
Is that a bad thing? That sounds like someone who's a CEO. That sounds like you're killing it. I love it. Okay, a harmonious relationship except for someone waking up at 4:30 in the morning. I love it. Have we got some friends down here? Friends are more willing to you guys pals? Yeah, cool. You're nodding more enthusiastically than you, sir. You're like, I don't know, we'll see. Depends if he's picking up the tab. What's a recent disagreement or thing that you've chatted about?
Tons of things. I think we chatted about like the U.S. involvement in Ukraine and what's the right level.
It's a great topic to rap about there, isn't it? So, okay, a couple where one wakes up at 4:30 and the U.S. involvement in Ukraine. Those are the two kind of tetchy issues that were going on. One tetchier than the other, I believe. And let's get a couple more suggestions. And these don't have to be related to that. They don't have to be related to the debate. Just be as creative and fun as you possibly can. So if you over the phone, shout it out nice and loud so that we can all hear it. Whoopee cushion. Thank you very much. Bringing some levity to the situation. Middle of the room. What are you guys going to come up with? Dragons, yes. What's your favorite thing about dragons, my friend?
Breathing fire.
Breathing fire, of course, yeah. Good. And then let's move over here. Finally, the final suggestion from you guys. What are you going to have a rap about?
Populism.
Populism? Yeah. You guys should team up with them as well, be all. That's what we want at the rap show. Okay, so this is going to be a freestyle, as I said, a rap made up on the spot, based on your suggestions on a partner who wakes up at 4:30, whoopee cushions, dragons and how they breathe fire, populism, and the US and its involvement in the Ukraine. Great. I know which section of the rap is going to be very short and brief. So if we can drop that beat, my friend. This, as I said, a freestyle. Are we going to press play on that? Yeah, there we go. Look at that. That's what happens. The crowd completely silent, just going, this is going to be the worst thing we've ever seen. It's not. It's going to be incredible, and it's going to start with you, madam. Here we go. First thing, practical joke, how I start sitting down on the chair and I hear that fart sound. I'm like, oh no, a jokester's near. On the whoopee cushion it can say it's a Bronx cheer. Never understood what it means. As a young gun, as a preteen, I was keen, playing all the pranks. It's not my fault, I used to switch that sugar shaker for salt, but the whoopee filled me with glee. It sounded like poo, didn't sound like pee, cause there's not a little noise. If you ask, a whoopee cushion for pee would just be a splash or a puddle that starts expanding. Gotta get your air in there, expand things, then it goes. That's the sound of when it deflates, when the thing goes down. Oh yes, I can break out of the prison of the mind. Let me move on to populism all the time. People gather there in the field, I'm popular. But you start to feel it doesn't mean that. It's like some things maybe leaders there on the right wing. They're like, yeah, we got a wild one on. Maybe shout out someone like Tucker Carlson trying to appeal to a very large gang. Oh yes, I might not understand like my boy over here. He'd be like, sir, please, my lady, wakes up early. Yeah, I'm gonna do a dirty alarm clock going off at 4:30. Please make no mistaken, it's fine if she's cooking me eggs and bacon, but no, she's having some fun. She starts exercising, maybe going out on a run, does the jogging, keeping ever so fit. I'm in bed, I feel like a little lazy person, but when she comes back, I prank on her with the whoopee attack. Yeah, I put it on the sofa cushion, she sits down, then she's blushing. It's ever so sad, feels me pain, I got shame. Anyway, move on to Ukraine. Yeah, the fun stops. War going on, yeah. Some blocks start blown up in Kyiv. All the Russians, they be like, oh, we should leave. But then Putin, he be getting angry, asks, no, I demand that you're there in the draft. Off to the front. It's not a thing for comedy in the US. Maybe they can do it properly. Put a lot of millions, billions too. They're like, careful, with this you could have blew up some things and it's out of order. If they attack over the Russian border, all hell might break loose. Look, I've really brought the mood down for all of you. But don't worry, one thing we admire, dragons in the sky when they're breathing fire. Oh yes, it never fails. You got the fun females there with the scales going around. Yes, you can see them on HBO, on TV. That's how we end, not how we start this Spitfire like the dragons. Dracarys. I'd like to see Kanye do that. That's an absolute pleasure. You guys are incredible. We're up for an incredible afternoon/evening of debate. Are you guys ready for that? Yeah. Well, it is my pleasure. It is a privilege to welcome to the stage your host and moderator for the debate. So please go wild, go crazy, and welcome Nick Gillespie.
All right, I really want to thank Chris Turner. You know, he's one more immigrant doing a job Americans won't do. Freestyle rapping before a debate about unions and unionization. That's what we're going to be talking about. This is Intelligence Squared, and this is No Laughing Matter, a new series which they built around my utter lack of humor. So we've got that to look forward to. We're going to be debating unions, and the proposition under debate is, do unions work for the economy? This is an interesting question because union membership peaked in the United States in 1954 at about 35% of the workforce. It is down now about 1 in 10, less, or maybe 1 in 10 workers in the country are unionized now. It's higher in the public sector, and we're going to talk about public sector and private sector. We're going to talk about why did it decline, and also, interestingly, polls have found that in the past couple of years, support for unionization is higher now than it has been since 1965. 71% of people say that unions are good, or they support unions and unionization. We read it in the headlines all the time. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And I guess before we get going, I'm curious, are there any union members in the audience? All right. I'll speak slower. Joking, but that's a sign of the times. There's about 10 people in the audience, and one of them is in a union. So we're going to be looking forward to that. This, you're going to see a good faith debate between two wonderful experts. It's a civil and good faith debate. This is something we need more of in this country, and this is something that Intelligence Squared is committed and dedicated to doing. I also want to let you know this is a radio show. It's going to be a radio show. So when you hear something that you like, I want to hear you clap as loud as F as you can. Can I hear you clap so we get a sound level? All right. Okay. And when you don't like what you hear, don't boo or hiss, maybe a low groan, but we're trying to keep it civil. You will get a chance to ask questions. We're going to have a microphone set up here where you can talk. You can ask questions. After you tell us what you ate for breakfast, where you went to school, and who your favorite Beatle was, then I'll ask you to actually ask a question. A concise question. Don't debate the debaters, and don't. This is not your time in the spotlight. Okay, just ask a question. But we're going to get a lot like that, and then we are about to get started. So what I'm going to do now is first we normally do a very scientific thing where you would vote using your cell phone, but we have a connectivity issue in America, which I think, that's what the midterms are about anyway, right? Or lack of so what we're going to do is we're going to go old school, and we're going to have a kind of clapometer, an applausometer. So I'm going to ask first, if you agree that unions work for the economy, would you please clap and howl or otherwise show your support? So first, do you believe that unions work for the economy? Okay. I'm making a note because the point of this debate is to change minds. So it's how many people go from that position to the other position. Now, if you don't agree that unions work for the economy, please make noise. Okay, so what is going to happen at the end? The winner of the debate, or not the winner, but what the debaters are trying to do is to get more people to agree with them at the end of the conversation than started. So the point is to bring more people to your side or not. And with that in mind, we are going to get started now. And I am going to introduce first the person who is arguing yes, that unions are good for the economy, is the journalist who covered labor for the New York Times for 19 years and has written a book called Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Stephen Greenhouse, please come to the stage and sit to my right. There he is, Stephen Greenhouse. New York Times journalist, covered the unions and the labor markets, author of Beaten Down and Worked Up. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. I'll try as many jokes as I can.
Okay.
And we'll fail.
And now arguing no, unions are not good for the economy, is pension economist, Bloomberg contributor, and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Allison Traeger. Please join me on my left. All right, so thank you both for joining us. If you have to, you're going to have to go through me if you want to really fight with each other. We want to have a good, clean fight with a lot of facts and a lot of analysis, but no name calling. You ready to go, Stephen?
Yes.
Allison, what about you?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so
No, what if, don't we first have to do a weigh-in?
we were supposed to do that already, and I broke the scale, so we're skipping that. We're going to go right to the opening statement. Stephen, you have 3 minutes. Let's get to it. You're up first. You answered yes. Why do you argue that unions work for the economy?
Well, our subject is, do unions work for the economy? When some people talk about unions, they focus on, when some people talk about the economy, they focus on maximizing corporate profits or maximizing the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The economy is about far more than that. The economy is about people and delivering goods and services to make people's lives better. Unions make people's lives better. Thanks to unions, many more people are in the middle class. People have retirement plans. People have medical coverage. People have much safer jobs. People have work-life balance that gives them time to spend with their family. I often think of the bumper sticker unions, the folks who brought you the weekend. And many Americans forget how bad many jobs used to be. A century ago, around 2,000 coal miners died each year on the job. Now only about 10 do. And we really need to thank unions for that huge improvement. Sitting here about a mile from the Lower East Side, which used to be the heart of the nation's apparel industry, and tens of thousands of apparel workers work brutal hours, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, often from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Right before coming here, I stopped at the what used to be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which is about a 5-minute walk just on the other side of Washington Square. At a time when there was very little regulations of workplaces and many employers didn't pay much attention to workplace safety, 146 workers died in 1911 in a horrific fire there. Most of them were women, many of them were teenagers. Now, thanks to unions, factories are infinitely safer, and very few people work 80-hour work weeks. During the Great Depression, FDR and the New Deal Congress thought that far too many Americans had very meager wages, and they thought, what do we do about this? So they wanted to increase workers' bargaining power, and they passed a landmark law that made it far easier to unionize. So in the late 1930s and 1940s, millions of Americans flocked into unions. And the powerful unions that they created greatly raised wages and built America's middle class, which was the world's largest middle class, thanks to unions. Many workers could finally afford to buy houses, could finally afford to buy cars. That increased consumer demand, and that in turn helped the overall GDP. This summer, as Nick mentioned, a recent Gallup poll found that 71% of Americans approve of unions. That means Americans overwhelmingly think that unions work for the economy. Starbucks workers, Chipotle workers, REI workers, Apple workers, museum workers, adjunct professors, graduate students, many of them are trying to form unions. Video game workers who are tired of working 80, 90 hours a week, they're trying to form unions. Amazon workers who are fed up with the stress and with the onerous production quotas and the difficulty in finding time to go to the bathroom, many of them want to unionize to make their lives saner and happier. And when unions make workers happier and less stressed out, unions work for the economy.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephen Greenhouse. Yes, unions work for the economy. Okay, Allison, you're taking the position that unions don't work for the economy. Take it away. You got 3 minutes.
All right. So when I was thinking about this question, I realized it's a very complicated question, but for once it actually has a very simple answer. The answer is no. But why is it complicated? Because what does it mean to work for the economy? Now, I'm an economist, and I thought this isn't a trivial question to me. Traditionally, economists thought working for the economy was rising GDP. And I think that's one way to think about it, but I think we're realizing another really important part of working for the economy is resilience. Not only resilience to the next financial crisis or the next pandemic or recession or inflation or whatever, but also resilience to an economy that's constantly in a state of change. We were once an agrarian economy, then we became an industrial economy, and now we're moving into the next phase, a tech economy. And an economy that works can manage to grow and prosper and still be a leader despite all of these changes. And then finally, I think another thing that's become what matters for working in an economy is that the prosperity is shared. And I think what we're going to find in the next hour or so is that the answer is union doesn't fulfill any of those goals. In fact, it hinders all of them. And that's why it doesn't work for the economy. Unions, among many other things, make companies a lot less dynamic. It's really hard to fire anyone who's not good at their job. It's really hard to give merit bonuses or pay to people who are good at their jobs. It's really hard to adopt new technology. We saw this with the car manufacturers. We even saw this with Hostess. Remember when they went bankrupt? So it becomes very hard to be a more dynamic workplace. And we also see in the public sector, unions have been a big hindrance to education reform, to building infrastructure projects within any sort of budget or any sort of reasonable timeline, which is a huge to taxpayers. Generally, they just make the economy much more sclerotic and a lot less dynamic, which is really, as we're changing, is one big reason why unions really are falling out of favor, not just here, but even abroad, even Europe, big stalwart of unions. They're becoming a lot less popular. So I think it's clear that, well, the question isn't, did unions help some people? Are they good for some people? Yeah, sure, of course they are. But are they good for the economy, which isn't just a few people, but everyone, and not just us, but people in the future? The answer is clearly no.
All right, thank you, Allison. What we're going to do now for about the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to have a discussion up here about various points about private sector unions. Then we're going to talk about public sector unions. Then we're going to go to audience Q&A. I guess let's start off, and I'll go to Stephen first. If unions are so self-evidently good for the workforce and for the economy, can you talk a little bit about the decline in membership? What are the main causes of that, and what does that say about the relevance of unions to the labor market today?
So, in my book, Nick, I write that America, of all the industrial countries in the world, the 3 dozen or so OECD countries, the United States, U.S. corporations are the most anti-union, the most aggressively anti-union. So that, to my mind, is one of the major reasons that union density has declined since 1980. Another,
But the, I mean, just to be
that's one
clear,
reason.
the decline
The
started
decline-
long before 1980.
but it really, really accelerated starting 1980. It was slow. So among the other reasons, the union rate decline is, a sharp decline in manufacturing. Many manufacturing jobs moved overseas. Official policy kind of soured on unions with, and Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers who participated in an illegal strike. It was not a coup, it was an illegal strike, but that made many, CEOs think, well, it's high time we really go after unions, really fight hard against unions. And there's been growth in the service sector, and it's in many ways harder to unionize bank workers or nail salon workers or restaurant workers than it is to unionize 10,000 workers in downtown Detroit or Flint, Michigan working. And also, some unions have fallen asleep on the job. They haven't done enough. But I would argue that overwhelmingly the main reason that union density has fallen so much is that corporate America fights so hard, as we're seeing now at Starbucks, firing over 100 pro-union workers. Amazon, is fighting very hard against unionization. Apple is opposing unionization. So I think if, there are many times when 80, 90% of workers at a worksite sign cards saying we want a union, then the corporation turns on this, full court anti-union press, with videos that are anti-union and screensavers on everyone's computer that are anti-union and phone calls and texts that are anti-union. And suddenly people, some pro-union workers will get fired and workers will get scared. They'll be told that our plant might close if you unionize, and people feel intimidated. And that's what's happening right now, I think, with Starbucks and Amazon. People start feeling very pro-union, but then the company really twists people's arm and people feel threatened, and they say, well, this is too scary, maybe we don't want a union.
Allison, do you find that convincing, that the decline in membership is fundamentally, it's partly related, I think I'm summarizing Stephen correctly, it is partly related to a change in work, but it's mostly because the ownership of companies is really kind of going after union efforts?
I mean, I think the corporate resistance is part of it, but whether or not it's most of it, not at all. I mean, first of all, when people, we keep throwing around that enthusiasm for unions is at record highs, but if you look at the statistics and break them out by age, picture looks very different. Pretty much it's more like 49% if you look at anyone over 50. Because a lot of the enthusiasm for unions are people who are too young to remember what a unionized economy really looks like. And in fact, a paper I read by Alan Kruger, a very well-known left-wing labor economist, was that he put most of the decline in unionship on the fact that people didn't want to unionize. And I think a big reason why is that as the economy changed, the role of unions just made less sense. When pretty much a lot of people when you were doing more manual work and it was less skilled and the work was more routine, banding together made a lot of sense. As I said, because when you join a union, you give up sort of high pay raises and stuff like that so everyone can have more stability. But in a more sort of tech service-driven economy, you sort of want all these sort of merit-based pays. So that's why a lot of workers just don't want to be unions and why a lot of union drives are still failing.
Are you buying that,
So I worked at the New York Times as a reporter for 31 years. We were unionized. I and many of my colleagues got merit pay increases. So it's a fiction to say that unionized workplaces can't have merit pay increases. You know, Allison said that unions do very little to increase broadly based, broadly shared prosperity. I emphatically disagree about that. Unions are really the only institution in American society that try across the board to lift living standards, lift pay of all workers. One of the great stories about in the 1950s and 1960s, when unions were strongest and were unionizing many people, was all these non-union companies rushed to raise their pay and raise their benefits because they were scared of being unionized. So there was a huge spillover effect where unionized places helped non-union workers. And a big problem in the United States is that so many employers are so emphatically anti-union that they don't want to cooperate with unions. You look at some of the greatest companies in the world are unionized: Daimler-Benz, BMW, Toyota, Honda, Siemens, Sony, Airbus, Boeing. So companies can be unionized and still be very successful.
Do you think, you're talking about the New York Times, but other more service-oriented places like a Starbucks, like a Chipotle, like Amazon, is there room for the owners of those business to kind of block unions by giving workers more fringe benefits, more compensation, more flex time and things like that? And is that happening, and does that depress the push for unionization?
So right now at Starbucks, Howard Schultz, whom Hillary Clinton wanted to name as labor secretary, right? Howard Schultz is doing his utmost to kill the union drive. And he's done something where he said, we will give increased benefits and raises to our non-union workers, but at the 250 stores where workers have voted to unionize, we're not giving you the raises, we're not giving you the benefits. And the union says, that's dirty pool. It's discriminating against people who've unionized, and it's really scaring the bejesus out about a lot of workers say, gee, if I vote for a union, I'm not going to get these benefits. And Starbucks is trying very hard to prevent the union from ever getting a contract, I believe, where they're really dragging things out. So a lot of workers see, Starbucks is giving these benefits to its non-union workers. It's giving them to its non-union workers, but not to its unionized workers. And workers are saying, maybe it's not a good idea to join a union. Other companies, Amazon has increased pay in many places when it faced a unionization drive, and that's very, very common. Unions, even when they don't succeed, often raise pay. Once upon a time, when I was about 25 years old, I was a reporter at the Bergen Record in Hackensack, New Jersey, and I was involved in a union drive. And on a Friday night, about 100 people signed up to go to a restaurant, to push for the union. And that Friday afternoon, on the bulletin board, magically appeared a notice from the CEO saying, everyone's getting a 25% raise. And we were very happy. And I should note that, the CEO who owned the paper, had his 5 Mercedes-Benz, and he probably didn't need all this money, and that wasn't, all the money going to him wasn't going to help the economy so much. But, that increase in pay going to me, who was making then $150 a week and working like 60, 70 hours a week, the increase in pay that many union members get really boosts the economy, and it creates broadly shared prosperity in a way that little else does.
Did that 25% raise stop the union effort?
Yes, it did.
All right. So, but everybody wins then?
Arguably,
Or
yes.
in that
Yes,
case,
fair enough.
yeah.
People are pretty happy, yes.
Allison, let me ask you, what is the role of unionization efforts, or a threat of unionization, in increasing compensation, wages and benefits and things like that, perks for workers, versus other parts of the economy? Because we are now going through a phase where wages are going up pretty quickly for in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. Is that because of fundamentally or primarily, is that because of fears of unionization, or what's going on with the
No,
economy?
I mean, that's largely because we have a very tight labor market and there's a shortage of workers. I mean, workers can be empowered a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be from unions. It can be from having sort of useful skills. It can be, as we see right now, sort of a shortage of labor. And I'd also disagree with the idea that unions are the only institution that share prosperity. I mean, we have the government. that, has a lot of sort of, social redistributive programs. And I mean, I think unions, before we had those institutions in place from the government, unions did, I will admit, play a very important role, especially in terms of standards for workplace safety. But the fact is we now have a government that does a lot of that role. And I think it's better placed on the government than on employers because it opens it up to sort of more hiring. There's also evidence that, a more unionized industry does create fewer jobs because jobs get more expensive. And, the money does have to come from somewhere.
Stephen, let's talk about the relationship between unions increasing wages and compensation, which is a cost, right, of doing business. Does that have an effect on unemployment or on the number of workers that a company might hire otherwise?
Yes, it does. I mean, when something's more expensive, someone might buy less of it. When workers' pay is much higher, an employer might hire fewer people. However, many, it's very good that all these people are earning more money. Maybe, that means, your spouse might not have to work because you're doing well.
That's the dream of every man in the audience.
And many women, yeah. I'm forgetting my next point. Sorry. I just want to add one more quote about broadly shared prosperity.
Sure.
This is from someone we've all heard of, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Out of its bold struggles, economic and social reform gave birth to unemployment insurance, old age pensions, government relief for the destitute, and above all, new wage levels that meant not mere survival, but a tolerable life. The captains of industry did not lead this transformation. They resisted it until they were overcome. And Allison's right. Government does some redistribution, does promote broadly shared prosperity, but it's often because unions push it to do far more. Unions push it to pass Social Security and pass Medicaid and raise the minimum wage and improve funding for child care.
Is unionism the primary driver of increased wages then, and better work habits? You talked about this a little bit, but can you drill down on that a little bit? And is the situation in, say, in the 1930s, is it analogous to the contemporary workplace?
No, and as I said, I think unions did a great service for the economy and for Americans back then, but we're in a very different time. We're in a very different economy, and the unions did push us to sort of build these institutions, but we have these institutions now, and so we should just work with them. I mean, pay increases for a lot of different reasons. I would agree that in the 50s and the 60s, unions did have a role in increasing pay. I mean, you have to remember the 50s and the 60s were a very different time. After the post-war era, I mean, all of Europe, they really had to rebuild. So really, the U.S. was the manufacturing center of the world, which gave companies an enormous benefit and all these profits, which they had to share with their workers. We don't have that now. It's a much more competitive global economy. So right now, if you do get big pay increases, it's usually a reflection of your skills. And another reason why unions make less sense now is it's a lot easier to monitor people in a workplace and see who's the most productive and who is not. And so people tend to that tends to drive pay now more than it used to.
Can you just explain that a little bit more? What do you mean?
Well, for instance, like Major League Baseball. As I said, all the whole Moneyball thing, which means like you can use data to figure out, and this is true whether you're on a factory floor or playing baseball, of who is the most productive person, who's the one who's adding the most value. Before, no one ever really knew, even in baseball. I mean, although it seems odd to me because you can just watch people play, but apparently data has really changed this. And it's true in all industries. So you can monitor who's more productive than not and sort of compensate them accordingly. When you really had no idea who was productive and who wasn't, there's a much bigger incentive for everyone to unionize, because if you were a high productivity worker, you may as well just throw your lot in with everyone else so you can get more stability. Now that stability is also less important because actually average tenure's been on the rise, anyway union's been on the fall. Like job stability isn't this huge concern it used to be. In fact, the bigger problem is that people aren't changing jobs enough because job changes are usually what brings pay raises.
Stephen, yeah, go ahead.
So, Alison said before that young people support unions because they don't know all the bad things about unions that their parents and grandparents know. I think a lot of young people support unions because they see we're a nation with huge income inequality, the worst income inequality in a century. Young people are hearing that their generation will be the first generation in American history to do worse than their parents. And yes, they're all told, go to medical school, go to law school, get an MBA. But every high school class has a bottom 50%, and not all of them are going to get MBAs and become lawyers. And a lot of people realize, how am I going to pull myself up? I'd love to do it by my own bootstraps. I'm way down by $50,000 in college loans. I can hardly afford the rent. I'm living with my parents. A union might be a way for me at Starbucks to go from $15 an hour to $20 an hour. So I think a lot of young people see unions as one thing they could hold on to, to pull them up. Professor at Columbia, Alex Hertel-Fernandez, recently did a big study saying that 74% of Americans aged 18 to 24 want to join unions. 75% of Hispanic Americans say they join a union if they could. 80% of African Americans say they would join a union if they could. 84% of African American women. So clearly, a lot of people who want to lift themselves up, many of whom are struggling, see unions as the way to go. And I just want to add that, I agree with Allison that, after World War II, many American companies were doing extremely well when the Europeans and the Japanese economy were on their backs. But, American companies weren't rushing to give good wages and benefits to their workers. It took some big, ugly, historic strikes to squeeze GM and Ford and Chrysler to really cough up the middle class wages that built the middle class and really made America, the American people, the richest people on earth. Now, the period from 1945, 1950 or so to 1980 or so is called the Great Compression, really the only sustained time in modern American history when inequality decreased. But since 1980, inequality has significantly increased. I was just looking at some numbers. Since union density really, it fell faster since 1980, the bottom 90% of Americans have, I think their share of the economy has dropped from around 66% to about 55%, and the top 10% has gone from, my numbers are going to be off like 35% to about 45%. My numbers don't quite add up, but so as unions have weakened, inequality has increased. Now, Allison's going to add, because she's so intelligent, globalization is also a factor pushing.
Yeah, let's let her answer for herself, though. So Stephen, raises the question of the relationship between unionization and inequality. And there's no question that, after World War II until sometime in the 70s, wages compressed, inequality lessened. What is the relationship of the unionization of the workforce to that phenomenon? And does the decrease in unionization explain a growing inequality in America?
No, I don't believe it's causal, which means I don't think the unions caused that. I think what brought down unions and what increased inequality was the same thing, which was more globalization and what we call skill-biased technical change. It's just where the economy changed, and it really did favor sort of high-end, high-skill workers more than everyone else. And that's also, to some degree, what undermined unions, because it made sort of paying lower skill for routine jobs a lot harder and encouraged mechanization in a lot of companies. Although I totally agree with Stephen that I think we pretty much have the economy figured out for high-skill people. I think people who, as I said, aren't on that path do need more help. I think that's absolutely true. I just don't think unions are the best way to help them anymore.
Can you, before we go back to Stephen, then what is the way to help those people that are lower skilled and are kind of being left behind in terms of wages and contemporary economy?
Well, I think one thing we could do is, as I said, we could do more government programs. I think we definitely need a lot more education. I think that's another problem. Actually, hurdle is unions, which have largely sort of prevented education reform. But I think as well, I think we also have a lot of government programs that are providing more protections. We have minimum wages. We sort of have government programs that I think are better suited for the modern economy.
Stephen, can I ask you, you paint a picture of kind of the historical role of unions in bringing up wages and things like that, but then you were talking about, auto workers, say in the post-war era when there was not a lot of competition within the United States. Auto manufacturers could pay their workers more and then pass the increase in price onto their customers. Allison has raised the specter of we're in a global economy now. Certainly GM, Ford, Ford is not even making cars anymore. Chrysler is not really a major manufacturer anymore. Everything has become globalized. So is it true that at least when it comes to manufacturing, we're in a global work environment now. So you're not going to see the ability of major industrial firms or large groups of workers being able to squeeze that kind of increase in compensation out of their employers.
It's certainly true that in the 1960s and 70s, when the American auto industry was king, and American auto workers were making high wages comparatively on the global scale, things were looking good. But as Allison said, when Germany and Japan rebuilt its economies that had all this new capital stock and its workers were paid less, it was much harder for American car manufacturers to compete. They had lousy models. Their models weren't sturdily built, and their wages were higher, and we became uncompetitive. But let's not forget that the main competitors that are beating the butt of American car makers are unionized. So unionized firms, Daimler-Benz, Volkswagen, Volkswagen has its problems. BMW, Nissan, Toyota, these are unionized companies. So it's wrong to think that just because something is unionized, it can't be competitive.
Yeah, can I ask you, Allison, to respond to the fact that Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, to name 3 Scandinavian countries, they have about a 65% unionization rate in their workforce. But all of them also rank higher than the United States in global indices of economic freedom and of global competitiveness. So is unionization actually a problem in either broader economic freedom or being able to compete with other countries?
Well, I think it's worth noting all those countries' union rates have also been falling steadily. Unionization in Sweden 20 years ago was about 80%, now it's 60%. So, that's a pretty dramatic decline, and I think shows that the global economy is moving away from unions. But to your point, unions also served a different role in these countries. First of all, the freedom has largely correlated with big reforms that have not been favorable to unions. Also, these are much smaller economies, which meant that unions had to be a lot more disciplined and couldn't ask for nearly as much as they did here, because they always knew that, like if you were, say, Volvo or Saab, that you were already in a very sort of tight global market. So they always asked for fewer concessions.
All right.
I just want to chime in. So I wrote a lot about the Fight for 15 a few years ago, and I remember meeting a fast food worker from Denmark who came to New York, and I ended up, after meeting that worker, I ended up working on a story with my New York Times colleague in Paris, Liz Alderman, and we did a piece saying, why is it that fast food workers in Denmark average more than $20 an hour, whereas at this time, 6, 7, 8 years ago, fast food workers in the United States averaged $8.50 an hour. And Big Macs cost only a smidgen more in Denmark. And it was because workers in Denmark had far more bargaining power, and there's sectoral bargaining, and basically fast food workers in the US had very little bargaining power. And the Danish worker had much more paid vacation, had paid sick days, learned her schedule like 3-4 weeks in advance, whereas a lot of American workers don't learn their schedule 3 days in advance. So again, there's something. I was a New York Times reporter covering labor for 19 years, and I tried being scrupulously fair as between, business and labor. But like 10 years into the beat, I was seeing something really broken in the U.S. economy. This was like in the early 2000s, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Corporate profits keep reaching record levels year after year. The stock market was climbing to record levels. Productivity per hour, per worker kept reaching record levels, but wages absolutely stagnated. Many corporations were getting rid of good defined benefit pensions and replacing them with much cheaper, much riskier 401ks. Many companies were getting much stingier on their healthcare plans. So there was this disconnect, and I wrote this book about saying the big squeeze, tough times in America. Why is it when corporations are doing so fantastically well that they're squeezing their workers so badly?
Okay, we're gonna pivot to public sector in a second, but I want to. I absolutely. So here, Stephen raises a good point, which is that profits have been very good, but wages don't necessarily seem to keep pace with that. What is the answer to that, if not, that we need a stronger labor movement in order to take some of the money that goes to the owners and shareholders of businesses and put them in the pockets of the people who are actually bringing those profits?
Well, actually, I know profits are higher than normal, but that is sort of aggregate profits. When you actually drill down a little bit more into the data, you see that there's a couple companies, we call them superstar companies, that dominate each industry and are extraordinarily profitable. But most other companies in that industry have very thin margins. And the evidence also suggests that these sort of super profitable companies pay their workers incredibly well. So I think that's part of the disconnect. Also, I mean, you might wonder then, well, why are wages becoming a smaller share of profits? Well, that's also because it's how we are measuring profits. When you actually account for capital depreciation and foreign profits, we see that actually the worker share of profits is about stable. So it really, when you dig into the data, you see, one, a lot of firms aren't very productive, and that's why they're not paying their workers as much, those who are do. And also, as I said, that this sort of like smalling labor share is actually not really depends on how you measure profitability.
All right, let's talk about public sector unions. And there is about 35% of the public sector workforce is unionized. So it's doing much better than the roughly 6% of the private sector market. Stephen, let's start with you. Is there a qualitative difference to the union presence and kind of the union reality in the public sector and the private sector? And if so, what is it?
Yes, I think private sector unions are kind of more oppositional. They say, the man is making all these profits. The billion-dollar investors are, making off all this money, which should be going to higher wages. And I think there's generally more tension, and they feel that there's something broken and unfair in the economy with all this income inequality and the stock market soaring until recently. And they said, why are wages, why for decades are wages stagnating? That's changed in the last 2-3 years. So it was more adversarial. In the public sector, unions, they're not, they don't see, the government as the bad guy, as the bad person. They kind of want to work with the government, and they want to make government work better. But there are, of course, tensions as well, because unions will often want, of course, higher wages, and that's really squeezing the taxpayer, and that it's much more politically delicate if you're a public sector union president than if you're a private sector union president.
What explains, such a higher rate of unionization in the public sector than the private sector, then?
Well, this ties back to what I was saying earlier. In the private sector, the employers are super aggressively opposing unions, much more so in Germany and France and Sweden and Japan. And whereas in the public sector, there's, one state's grant workers the right to bargain. And under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which gave American workers a federally protected right to unionize, that only covered private sector workers, not public sector workers. So each state has to decide whether to give its public sector workers a right to unionize. So once a state gives them the right, generally, mayors and city council presidents don't fight against the union. And also, unions sometimes often give donations to politicians, so the politicians don't fight against them, and that can be very complicated.
Allison, what is the difference between public and private sector unionization, and where does that lead in terms of outcomes for the economy, not necessarily for the particular workers, but the economy?
Well, I mean, it's terrible. I mean, it also corrupts our political process. I mean, unions are amongst the biggest donors. Sort of former teachers are sitting on school boards. One of the reasons why there's not this adversarial relationship is unions say to the politicians, is like, I can get you elected or not. So they actually...
I'm not exactly sure what that clapping signifies, but I'm nervous.
I made a good point.
They're trying to prevent the Koch brothers from controlling this.
So, but as I said, I think we show up in terrible ways the economy. I mean, honestly, I think this proposition is answered just by the school shutdown for the last year, which unions had a big role in, which deprived, especially a lot of poor children, of education, which they're never going to recover from. I mean, that's terrible for the economy.
Okay. Stephen, talk to that, because one of the arguments against unions in the private or the public sector is that it makes workplaces and the economy less responsive to changes in reality or in consumer demand. That does seem to be the case with schools, right? That we want different types of schools, but it's hard to do that if unions are saying no, we're not going to do that.
So again, many studies have found, states, that are high, that have, where the teachers union, where teachers are highly unionized, they have better education results by and large than states where there isn't much union density among teachers. Teachers.
And I'm sorry, just to put a face on that. So a state like Massachusetts does
Minnesota,
very well
Oregon,
in
Washington, New
outcomes,
York,
and
New
they
Jersey,
have
then
relatively-
Mississippi, Louisiana.
Okay.
So, I think teachers unions got the message a few years ago that you have to work harder to improve schools. And they've de-emphasized trying to raise pay, and they've really emphasized improving schools. And the teachers unions have made it easier to get rid of bad teachers. Some might argue it's still too tough, but they've gone a long way to make it easier to get rid of bad teachers. We've seen these recent strikes, a few weeks ago in Minnesota, a few weeks ago in Columbus, Ohio, a few years ago in LA and Chicago, where the unions are pushing for more nurses, more school nurses, more librarians, more school counselors, better class sizes. The LA strike, they're protesting class sizes of 38, 40, 42. The Arizona teacher strike, I interviewed a teacher, second-year teacher who's making $34,000 a year. How many of you would want to go teach for $34,000 a year? So there are real problems in the schools, and yes, there are school boards where things are too cozy between the union and the school board. I totally agree, Allison. But there are many school boards which are dominated by the Koch brothers' money and Walton brothers' money, Walton money, and they want to shrink the state, and they don't want to give enough money to unions. And the big historic teacher strikes in 2018 in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona, and all three states, there are very conservative legislatures that all voted big tax cuts for the rich, big tax cuts for corporations, big tax cuts for fracking, and they didn't leave enough money for the schools. And certainly in those states, the unions did not control the state legislatures, and the unions said, we have to change this because what the state legislature is doing is really bad for our children and our schools.
Very quickly, Allison, do you want to talk about other types of public sector unions? Because police unions, firemen unions, prison guard unions in California are very powerful. What kind of, do they exert a positive or negative influence on the economy?
Absolutely not. I mean, police have stood in the way of a lot of police reform. As you point out, in California, the prison union were one of the big sort of pushers for the three strikes law, which increased a lot of sort of imprisonment and committed mass incarceration. Also, I mean, back to the teachers. I mean, one of the reasons why their pay is so low is that, the public sector unions have lobbied a lot for sort of very expensive public sector pensions, which are, one, bankrupting Illinois, but also means that you can't pay young teachers as much, which makes it a lot harder to recruit high-quality, energetic young teachers because all of their pay is backloaded, and that's all. The public sector unions have been very resistant to any sort of defined contribution pensions, which actually don't necessarily have to be risky. And sort of this makes it really hard to retain high quality public services. Also, I think we also should bring up sort of the cost that unions and public sector unions are putting on building infrastructure. We've all read those horrific stories about how we have the most expensive subway construction cost in the world. We hire 4 people for every 1 job they do everywhere else.
But we have the best looking subway riders.
But
Okay, sorry.
But Allison,
All
subway
right.
construction
Well,
in other countries
yeah.
is also highly unionized. So there's something dysfunctional about management.
But
in the
not,
United
but not the
States.
management. That's the difference. Like, and sort of they might have the sort of people who build the tunnels be unionized, but at every level of is unionized in New York.
Let's go to the audience Q&A. If you want to, please line up over here in the microphone, and I'm going to ask you to, ask a question. If you're with the press or a media outlet, please identify who you are, not for surveillance purposes, but so that you can brag when this goes out on NPR or other places. So first question, please.
Yeah, I have a question for Allison. So you said that in terms of private sector unions, that the force that prevents, harm to worker happiness, depressed wages should be the government, which feels like it's nice to say, but like we're not Scandinavia, we don't have universal health care. We have a lot of forces working against our government, making our
Okay, so the question is?
So what prevents a race to the bottom, like for companies? Like what prevents them from paying less when they have a shortage of workers?
Thank you.
Well, right now they do have a shortage of workers, and actually one of the forces against universal health care is unions.
Could you explain that briefly? Yeah.
Well, I mean, as I said, they were against sort of the tax on Cadillac plans. I mean, one of their big benefits that they give to their constituents is good health plans. So it sort of undermines their value when if we had government-sponsored health care.
All right. Thank you. Next question.
Can I just disagree? Unions
sure.
are overwhelmingly for universal health coverage. They opposed the tax on expensive health plans. That's true, but that's a different issue.
But that's how we paid
from
for it.
opposing. There are many. That was not the way we were going to pay for universal health coverage. That would have to be done by broader taxes overall.
Next question, please.
Sure. You guys talked a lot about the automotive industry and manufacturing in America, and you mentioned a bunch of companies that have largely unionized workforces in Japan and in Germany, but many of those companies have brought manufacturing to America in the South, where they've intentionally targeted markets that don't have unions and make the automakers in Detroit even more uncompetitive. How do you feel about that dynamic and the impact it has on the Rust Belt?
Let's start with Steve.
The German automakers, the Japanese automakers, the Korean automakers, they're very, very successful, being very unionized where they are, and they have to, it's much easier to unionize in Germany and Japan than it is in the U.S. So they come to the U.S. and they say, gee, we could live with, we're not being pressured to have a union. We can make more profits this way. So they, in an anti-union country where it's very hard to unionize for all sorts of reasons, they say, let's take the low road anti-union route, and it will make it easier for us to undercut the unionized Detroit automakers.
Is that good for the economy? We understand why they do it. Is it good for the economy?
Yes and no. I mean, it creates jobs. That's good. It will help shareholders in Japan and Germany. Would the workers say, well, gee, I wish I made $28 an hour rather than $20 an hour, and would that help create more broader prosperity? Yes. So yes, it's good, it creates jobs, but I think it would be better if the workers were paid more, which would help create broader prosperity.
Can I just make
quickly.
a point there that in 2009 those factories were still profitable and didn't need a bailout, while the automakers in Detroit did.
All right. Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, at one time I worked for a nonprofit healthcare in HR, so I wasn't unionized, but the employees were. And one of the complaints was that the more money they made every year, the more money they paid in union fees. And so I was just curious if either of you know that ratio of as pay might increase, what is being paid out to union fees, and if that helps the economy.
Anyone?
So, unions charge dues. They are institutions that need money to run. Some charge a flat $25 a month or $50 a month. Some charge 1% of pay or 1.5% of pay. And as your pay goes up, your dues will go up, and the union will say, perhaps justly, perhaps not, we helped increase your pay, and so you should stay paying the 1%. And some workers are very happy to do it, and some workers are unhappy with their union dues. And this study came out yesterday saying that unionized workers over their lifetime earn $1.3 million more than comparable non-union workers. And I tweeted this out, and someone said, well, what about union dues? And I said, if you pay $1,000 or $1,500 in union dues per year times a 40-year career, that's $40,000, $60,000. That's a lot less than 1.3 million. I will also question the 1.3 million. That sounds a little high, Allison. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, is that for the whole economy or comparable
It's
industries?
It's for the whole economy.
Well, yeah. I mean, because you have more white-collar unions working now.
Let's go to the next question. Thank you very much.
How much would you say easily. They can shame their employers on social media or praise them for good conditions, so that it puts natural pressure on employers to improve conditions and therefore makes unions less necessary than they might have been in the past.
Thank you. Allison, you want to go first?
I think they definitely do. I think workers are getting power from all sorts of places. And also technology also isn't so great for unions too, because, if you make now, before, as I said, in the 60s, there wasn't a lot of competition. Now there's not only foreign competition, but if you make sort of the cost of labor way too high, then you can also just turn to technology. So it can be powerful, but it can be very sort of a danger to workers, particularly for unions.
Stephen,
Great question, and it really cuts both ways. I agree with Allison. One way, it empowers workers because if you want to organize, you can do it by social media, you can do it by Zoom. It in ways makes unionizing easier. It's harder for the boss to look over your back. On the other hand, greater technology means you're competing now with bright people in Russia or Ukraine or Japan or Singapore who could take away your job from you. The New York Times had this great front page story a few weeks ago by Jody Cantor about algorithmic management, where cameras and sensors tell you're working at home and they tell whether you're at your computer every minute, every hour, and if you go away to the bathroom and then the camera snaps your picture, then you're not there, you might get paid for that hour. And I see that unions in Norway and Germany are saying there's something broken with algorithmic management. It's driving a lot of workers crazy. It's stressing them out. And we, the unions, want to step up to try to make this more humane and fairer so that workers aren't fired improperly for that.
All right, let's go to the next question.
You talked a lot about the differences between now and, say, in the 1950s and 60s. So I'm wondering what the parallels are now, though, compared to that time with rightward shifts in the U.S. and Scandinavia. We're now more of a service economy, as you mentioned, but compared to a manufacturing economy. But what are the similarities between now and then, which you've said, started the need for unions in the first place?
Thank you very much. Allison, you want to go first?
Well, I think it's also a time of great change, and change makes people uncomfortable. So, to some degree, I think that was what was so attractive about unions is there was a sense of community there. But as I said, unfortunately now, for the way the economy is changing, becoming more globalized, more technical, it doesn't really confer the same benefits. And as I said, people can find community elsewhere, or to some degree as well, are looking for different things from their labor
Thank
force.
you. Stephen, anything to add to
as
that?
we were discussing, the 1950s was kind of a rising tide for America. Corporations were doing very well, and they had money to share with their workers, and the workers really pressured them into sharing with their workers. Now, we're in a more competitive world, and one might say, well, that's a reason, not to favor unions. But, corporate profits have been way up. The stock market until recently was way up. Income inequality is way up. You look at these charts showing that since union density started to fall in 1980, well, from 1945 to 1980, basically productivity per hour rose, compensation per hour rose at basically the exact same rate as productivity per hour. Since 1980, with unions declining, productivity has risen 3 times as fast generally as compensation per hour. So I think a lot of workers could say, we are not getting our fair of the pie, and even though the world is more competitive, we still need to unionize.
Thank you. Allison, can I ask you to talk about that for that stat about how productivity, that workers are not being compensated as much for productivity gains as they had been? Do you agree with that, and is that an issue?
Well, no. Productivity is based on sort of the value of both capital and labor. And if you're a high productivity worker, you are getting compensated for that. The problem is sort of low productivity workers aren't. And to some degree, I think that's a problem, because can you earn a living wage anymore if you're not a high productivity worker? No. But I'm not sure why unions or particularly employers need to subsidize people for that, which is effectively what we're demanding.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi there. I've done a bit of work in corporate culture in a unionized setting, and I was curious to hear from both your perspectives, since you've clearly thought a lot about it. Do you have any perspective on ways that we could reduce some of these inefficiencies, frictions that we have spoken about unions in a corporate setting? How can we make it better, if not getting rid of them or not even having that debate necessarily? What do you recommend?
I think we should think about the role of, not say unions, but more sort of worker co-ops, where they're not necessarily negotiating for for pay or for sort of hours, but instead I think a big problem, as I said, is things like high quality benefits, sick leave, things like that. And what you could do is you could have workers to come together on their own and sort of do all sorts of risk sharing, sort of come together to sort of get good rates on healthcare. And I think we need to think about new models that aren't necessarily these adversarial relationships where someone's demanding something of employers, but instead of workers coming together and doing more sort of the banes of diversification.
Thank you. Stephen? I mean, and I guess let me just kind of make that a little more narrow. Work has changed a lot since the heyday of unions in the 50s. Do unions need to change in how they interface with management and the types of things that they ask for?
I think something wrong with the way so many Americans look at unions. In other, I was I was based in Paris for 5 years with the New York Times. I was the European economics correspondent. I interviewed CEOs in Germany and Spain and Italy and France and the Netherlands and Scandinavia. And these folks didn't hate unions. They didn't see unions as the devil. They saw unions as social partners that we have to work with to build, to increase profits and to build more prosperity and to increase production and productivity. In the United States, so many CEOs see unions as the devil, and they don't want to work with them. And I think a lot of companies could become more productive, could increase production, could become even more profitable if they stop fighting tooth and nail against unions. And there are all these studies showing that when employers are unionized, there's less turnover. Employees become more loyal. They often become more productive. They're less scared about giving input on how to increase production. I interviewed a union leader in Wisconsin who also is a child care worker, and he says, if you're not in a union and you go to your boss and say, I have some ideas on how we could increase inefficiency in the department, then if you don't have a union, the boss is going to say, do you want to clear out your desk now or after lunch? So unions can really encourage workers to step forward to help make the entity, the institution.
Thank you. Can I ask also, do unions need to stop looking at the owners or management as the devil? I mean, does it go both ways?
Yeah, I don't think many unions look at employers like the devil, but some really,
Well, maybe not the devil, but the
yeah,
Koch brothers.
Yeah,
then.
well,
they look at them like the Koch brothers.
I mean, unions want to get along, and unfortunately, labor relations in the United States aren't as good as they should be. And I hope Allison agrees. Some CEOs are too polarizing, too bullheaded, and some unions are. And it would be good if we all learn to live together, get together, to get along.
Okay,
yes.
let's. We have time for about one more question. Make it a good one, and make it a question.
Yeah, no pressure there.
No, not at all, sir.
So today we spent a lot of time talking about the history of unions and where we are with unions, which I guess is the prompt of the debate. But I am just curious though, like what is the future of unions, especially in light of automation and artificial intelligence, where a lot of studies have come out and said that a lot of jobs in modern economy are going to be lost to AI and automation. So, like on both sides, how do you reconcile with that?
Okay, let's, and if you think we got problems now, wait until the robots start unionizing, right?
Again,
I mean, what are we going to do? Stephen,
that's the 64 million or 64 billion or 64 trillion dollar question. That's a really tough one. I mean, what's going to happen to unions? What's going to happen to workers? What's going to happen to unemployment rates if AI and robotics comes on strong? I do think, however, that there's a legitimate fear that if AI and robots replace many workers, the people who own the technology will get a huge share of the fruits of production, and the unfortunate souls who've been laid off are going to be in trouble. And some will say we need to unionize that smaller group that's employed. Some will say we need universal basic income, because so many people won't be working. But John Kenneth Galbraith said wrote in the 1950s that unions are a very important countervailing force to corporate power, and I've written about unions in Las Vegas where hotels are introducing all sorts of new technology and workers are getting wiped out, and it's important for union to have a voice in protecting workers as new technologies are introduced.
Okay.
So-
Allison,
so-
what do you think about the role of hyper automation, we might call it, in terms of labor issues?
I think your question is exactly why Unions Day has passed. Because I think what we see from history is that you can't fight technology. And unions historically have made companies very resistant to adapt technology, which just makes them less competitive. So what we need to do is as I said early on, I said, what makes an economy healthy? It's an economy that's resilient, that can change. And I said unions hold back change. So, I mean, is it concerned what's going to happen to a lot of workers? Absolutely. But unions are only going to make it worse.
All right.
I just want, I'm going
Let's move on. We have time for one more question. Thank you for that one. This is almost certainly the last question. Okay, I don't mean to make this, kind of a cliffhanger here, but what is your question, please?
Hi, thank you both so much. All of you, thank you. Allison used the term unskilled labor to differentiate between people like our waiters and waitresses here at the venue.
I didn't call them unskilled.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by unskilled labor? Who that is? Can you define the people you're talking about? And with that definition, what are the basic needs you think that people require, and how do you support that to make sure that the economy is resilient? This is a big chunk of the population you're talking to here.
All right. Thank you very much. Allison?
So, I mean, usually, economists use skill level to be correlated with education, although I don't think that's necessarily true always. It's someone who just said knows how to do their job, knows how, has a lot of knowledge and information on how to do their job well, how to do it productively, and as I said, having those skills be relatively scarce.
Okay.
Can I just
Stephen?
very, very
Yep.
quickly. So, some people say that, with the new economy, with technology, the workers at Google and Facebook don't need unions. The 25-year-olds who are making $250,000 a year at Facebook or Google, I don't think they need a union. They're doing fine, thank you. Although some of them think we need a union because we don't want Google providing technology to the government to separate immigrants from their families. But there are a lot of people at Google and Facebook who do need unions and would really benefit. The janitors, the cafeteria workers. So I think we should keep that in mind when we say maybe we don't need unions in the new economy. And just one quick story. Walter Reuther, the famous head of the United Auto Workers, was visiting an auto factory in Cleveland in the 1950s, and they had introduced some very rudimentary robots. And one of the auto executives said, these folks are really going to replace a lot of your workers. What are you going to do about it? And he said, and Reuther said to them, well, these robots will never be able to afford to buy a car. So AI, and automation, if it puts many people out of work, it's going to create serious problems for the economy. It's important to have unions to help make sure, that workers, that average Americans have a say in shaping the new economy.
But how can they do that if they don't have jobs? I mean, you need to be employed to have a union work for you.
Well, you talk about inventing new forms of unions, so there could be.
No, I
just
didn't
like
say unions. There's a co-op. Because they're
okay.
not.
Well,
they're not
like the
negotiation-
freelancers, yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
well,
we agree we need new forms, Allison. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we have had, opening statements, a back and forth, audience Q&A, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of the audience questions. Thank you so much for standing in line. Sorry we didn't get to you. Now we're going to go to closing statements, and each of our participants has 2 minutes to make a final set of closing remarks. Allison, Stephen went first. You get to go first now in the closing statement, so give it your best shot.
So I've been a member of a union, and I've been talking the last couple of weeks to all my friends who have and about their experiences. And I think one of the most things that stuck with me is a friend of mine who used to work for NPR. I don't think you'll find a group of people more amenable to unions than NPR workers. But even he was like, I had to leave because the union was driving me crazy. He's like, first of all, while you could in theory get merit-based pay, no one ever asked for it because everything was already sort of pre-negotiated. So bosses, unless someone was threatening to leave, would never give merit-based pay, and most people didn't know they could even ask. He said, but the worst thing was during the pandemic was, NPR has been going through a lot of changes, like a lot of industries. People don't just turn on the radio anymore and consume NPR. They're more moving to podcasts. And with the sort of explosion of podcasts, there's never been more competition for radio shows. So he's like, so the needs that we have is changing. And he's like, during the pandemic, we faced some serious budget shortfalls. But the problem was there's a lot of people who no longer have the skills to work at NPR. He's like, we couldn't get rid of anyone. So we all had to take across the board wage cuts. And while they did have to get rid of people, they had to get rid of entire shows. They couldn't just get rid of the people who no longer were working well at NPR. Maybe were never good at their jobs, or even if they were, just didn't have the skills anymore to contribute. So he's like, in the end, it just got to the point where he had to leave because the unionization at even NPR is holding them back from embracing the future. And I think this is a good parable for all sorts of jobs, particularly more high-tech jobs. The economy really needs to if we're going to find new places for work, I'm optimistic that AI and all this stuff, there will still be jobs for everyone, because it always has in the past. And maybe I'm just an optimist. But one thing we do know from economic history is the way that works and benefits all workers is if we're resilient and we're adaptable. And unions stand in the way of that.
All right. Thank you, Allison, for that statement. And I guess I'm sure I'm not the only person asking, what kind of tote bag did your friend get when he left NPR? But, okay, Stephen, you will have the final say tonight. Your rebuttal, please, as to why unions work for the economy.
First, it's been a pleasure debating Allison, really.
Thank you.
Really, thank you. So, one of my favorite statements about the economy comes from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And they said in a pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, the economy should work for people, not the other way around. Without labor unions, the economy would work far, far worse for people. There would be a smaller middle class, more income inequality, more low-wage jobs, more people without paid vacation and paid sick days, more people without health coverage, more people without work-family balance, more people working 70-hour weeks. So unions have made a better life for millions, even tens of millions of Americans. Now I know, Alice and others have pointed out, there are problems with unions just as there are problems with corporations. Yes, there are problems with police unions. I've written about that. Yes, there's been some corruption in unions. Yes, there's some bullheaded union leaders who oppose needed changes. But overall studies show that unions don't hurt productivity. Unions reduce income inequality. Unions increase overall prosperity. And just because there'll be some bad apples in unions, among corporations, you can think of Union Carbide and Bhopal. You could think of Facebook, leaking private material to Cambridge. You could think of BP and the Deepwater Horizon explosion and the Enron scandal. And there are many corporate scandals. But are we going to say corporations don't work for the economy? Unions are huge institutions, and they make some mistakes. There are some wonderful visionary leaders, and there's some leaders not so great. But unions do try to build a better economy. Lastly, people sometimes say we don't need unions. They're not good. They're not relevant to the new economy. Don't tell that to Richard Ramirez. He's a worker for Google in Seattle. His job is to receive food shipments and store food shipments for the company. He wasn't really excited about a union when there was a unionization effort. He was making $20 an hour. He had huge problems with his commute. He had a three-hour commute. And there was, during the pandemic, 4,000 food workers at Google unionized. His pay went from $20 an hour to $27 an hour, 35% raise. And also, he had health insurance that had no premiums, and he was very happy. And he said, since we unionized, I have bought a home, and that was basically only because we unionized. Unions have worked very well for Richard Ramirez's and millions of other Richard Ramirez's. The economy works best when we have broadly shared prosperity. What unions are all about are trying to create broadly shared prosperity, and that's why unions work for the economy.
All right, thank you very much. And now what I want everyone in the audience to do is to start thinking and making your mental calculation. Whatever your starting point was, were you persuaded to the other side or not? That's really what I'm going to ask to measure when we come back to thinking about this. But right now, I'm very excited to announce that we have a special guest who is going to talk a little bit about the connection between comedy and debate and the need for it. I want to introduce Colin Quinn, comedy legend, debater. Can you squeeze through? All right. So Colin Quinn, thank you so much for showing up at the inaugural No Laughing Matter.
I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
I'm
So,
glad everyone's so excited they didn't give me a chair.
yes, this is so.
You could sit on my lap if you want to.
By the way,
He says that to everyone.
You're not talking about the other Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
That was an unfortunate.
You have a warped mind, sir.
Yeah, but that did spring to mind. So a lot of people are asking why Intelligence Squared is bringing debates to the Comedy Cellar and to the Village Underground. Some find it confusing, if not counterintuitive. Can you explain the connection between comedy and debate?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, there is a connection. It never used to be. And where comedy is up for debate, which is debatable. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a public forum, and comedians get paid, debaters don't. But still, it's yeah, I mean, it's become debate only because of social media. Comedy was originally meant way long back in the day to elicit laughter only, but now it elicits controversy and debate.
All right. This series is called No Laughing Matter. Do you think it's important to have serious debates at a place like the Comedy Cellar?
I mean, why not?
You're still thinking about Richard Ramirez, aren't you? Yeah.
The Night Stalker.
John Wayne Gacy. What kind of did he have a union as well, or? Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Let's go to the next one.
Okay, so at Intelligence Squared, the group, the nonprofit that's putting on these debates, we are dedicated to protecting democracy through the free exchange of ideas, examining them with respect and tolerance for both sides or all the sides in a given issue. What do you think? And you've touched a little bit on this, on the the politicization of comedy, but how's a good way to ensure that comedy and debate both thrive against the backdrop of both extreme partisanship in everything and cancel culture?
I mean, if I had the answer to that, I'd be charging a lot more than I mean, yeah, that's the biggest problem today, I guess, is that people really don't believe in debate. I mean, I think that's the one good thing about social media. It's revealed that nobody believes in compromise and nobody believes in free speech.
Well, do you think, I guess, then that comedy, can comedy be used to, get people to lighten up a little bit so that we can actually have conversations about things we disagree
I
with?
mean, apparently not, because it's one of these things where everybody's just decided that comedy is just the amount of focus on comedy itself is very revealing to me.
Is that good for you, or is it bad for you?
Well, it's good for me. It's good for comedians and all pretensions of being like kind of philosopher, warrior things.
Right.
But it's not good in the grand scheme of when you're on stage and people are throwing beer cans like that.
So the late, great Gilbert Seldes once said that comedy is the last refuge of the nonconformist mind. We hope it works for debate as well. Do we need more nonconformity, or do we need more tolerance for nonconformity in today's America?
Well, I mean, what kind of person would I be if I said, no, we need more conformity?
You would be, I don't know. So,
Even if I believed it, I wouldn't say it.
I don't really have an answer for that, so I want to thank Colin Quinn for talking a little bit about why Intelligence Squared is partnering with the Comedy Cellar to have debates at a place that is becoming hellish because nobody likes comedy anymore. Right? So, thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right. Careful getting down. All right, so that right now what I'm going to ask is, and we're going to have to do this with the old applausometer, so it's going to be a bit subjective, but if you started out believing that unions work for the economy, okay, and you have changed your position to thinking, maybe they don't, I'm going to ask you to clap. So please make noise if you no longer think that unions work for the economy. All right. Slow build. Maybe this is kind of like at the end of Officer and a Gentleman, you know, the clapping scene in the, what I'm pretty sure was a non-unionized paper bag factory. Okay, and now, if you started out thinking that unions didn't work for the economy, but now you think, you know what, maybe they do, please make noise. Okay. All right. Thank you. I think we have seen in that. It sounds like Stephen pulled a few more people to his side. So
Allison did great.
I want to thank, I want to thank Allison Schrager and Stephen Greenhouse for debating for Intelligence Squared in our No Laughing Matter series at the Village Underground of the Comedy Cellar. Thank you so much for parsing out whether or not unions work for the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again. And I think that concludes our program. I'm Nick Gillespie. Thanks so much for coming out. At the next one.